It was a warm summer afternoon, and the small town where I had lived for nearly all my life was quiet, just as it always had been. At 76, I didn't get out much anymore. The slow rhythm of the days suited me just fine. I spent most of my time in the comfort of my armchair, reading novels and reminiscing about the days when I was younger, full of energy and curiosity. My nephew, Stephen, had promised to visit me that day. He was a good young man, always checking in on me, making sure I was doing well. I appreciated his attentiveness, especially since many of my peers had long been forgotten by their families. He wasn't coming alone today either. He mentioned bringing his best friend Nick. Nick was a name I'd heard often, but we'd never really spent any time together. Stephen always talked about him with admiration, as though he was closer than a friend, more like a brother. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I slowly stood up and walked to the door. There stood Stephen, tall and strong as ever, with that bright smile that could light up the darkest room. Next to him was Nick, who was just as I imagined, confident, charming, and with a hint of mystery in his eyes. "Hi, Auntie," Stephen greeted me warmly, stepping in for a hug. "This is Nick. Finally brought him over to meet you properly." "Nice to meet you, ma'am," Nick said politely, offering a handshake. His hand was firm, and I could tell immediately that this man had a presence, one that could easily command attention. "Nice to meet you too, Nick," I replied, smiling back. "Come in, both of you." We settled into the living room, and they made small talk, asking me how I was doing and if I needed help with anything around the house. I assured them I was fine. Truth be told, I enjoyed their company more than anything else they could offer. Having young people around breathed new life into the old house. As the afternoon rolled into evening, the three of us continued chatting. They told me about their work, their hobbies, and their dreams. I found myself more engaged than I had been in a long time. Their energy was contagious, and before I knew it, Stephen had proposed an idea, something that made me raise my eyebrows. "Auntie, how about we take a little drive? Just the three of us. It's been a while since you've been out of the house, hasn't it?" I paused for a moment, thinking about it. It had been a while indeed. Though I was still quite mobile for my age, I rarely ventured far beyond my porch. Yet, something about Stephen's suggestion excited me. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something different, of breaking the mundane routine of my daily life. "A drive, you say?" I replied with a playful smile. I suppose I could be convinced. Stephen grinned, looking over at Nick. "You hear that? She's in." Before I knew it, we were in Stephen's car, an old but well-maintained vehicle that he'd had since college. Nick sat up front with Stephen while I sat in the back, the windows down, as we cruised through the sleepy town. There was something about the breeze, the hum of the engine, and the company that made me feel younger than I had in years. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and for a moment, I forgot my age entirely. And then, without warning, Stephen turned off the main road, heading down a quiet, narrow path that I hadn't seen in years. It led to a secluded spot by the lake, a place I used to visit when I was much younger. The car slowly came to a stop at the edge of the lake, its calm waters reflecting the colors of the evening sky. It had been so long since I'd been here. This was a place filled with memories for me, memories of my youth, of late nights spent laughing with friends, and stolen moments of peace. Being back here stirred something inside me, a nostalgia so strong it almost took my breath away. As Stephen cut the engine, the silence around us grew, only broken by the gentle lapping of the water and the distant chirping of crickets. Nick stepped out of the car first, stretching his arms, and Stephen soon followed. They both turned to me. "You all right, Auntie?" Stephen asked, a concerned look on his face. "Not too much for you, is it?" I shook my head, chuckling softly. "Oh, don't worry about me. I feel more alive than I have in years. This place, it brings back memories." "I bet," Nick said, his voice low but curious. He leaned against the car, arms crossed, watching me with those keen eyes. "What kind of memories, if you don't mind me asking?" I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't often that I shared stories from my past with anyone, let alone with young men like them. But something about this evening felt different. The fading light, the quiet of the lake, the way Nick and Stephen listened intently, it all seemed to create a space where I could be more open, more vulnerable. Oh, you know, the usual things. We'd come here as kids, swim, talk about life. Then, as we got older, well, this place was a little more secretive. A quiet spot for people who wanted to get away from prying eyes, I said with a slight smile. It was a place for things that were never spoken of in polite company. Stephen grinned. Sounds like you were quite the rebel back in the day, Auntie. Maybe, I replied, my smile widening. Maybe not as much as some, but I had my moments. There was a comfortable silence for a moment. I could see the gears turning in Stephen's mind, his curiosity piqued. Nick remained quiet, still observing me, but I could tell he was just as intrigued. I'm glad we brought you out here, Stephen said suddenly, his voice softening. You've been cooped up for too long, Auntie. You deserve to have more nights like this, you know. I nodded, feeling a warmth in my chest that wasn't from the setting sun. It's been a while since I felt this alive, Stephen. Thank you for this. He smiled, then glanced over at Nick, who nodded in agreement. There was a silent understanding between the two of them, as though they had planned this all along. I wasn't sure what exactly they had in mind, but something in the air felt different, almost electric. Stephen leaned back against the car, his eyes fixed on the horizon. You know, Auntie, I've always admired how sharp you still are. Not many people at your age can remember the things you do, let alone appreciate them. It's inspiring, really. That's kind of you to say, I responded, genuinely touched. But you know, I think it's more about the company. The people you surround yourself with can keep you young at heart, and you two have certainly done that for me today. Nick, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, almost soothing. I think you're right about that. Life's not just about what you've been through, but who you're with when you go through it. There was something about the way he said it that made me pause. The way both of them looked at me, with an intensity that was hard to describe, made me feel like they saw me not as an old woman, but as someone still full of life. It was as though age had become irrelevant in that moment, and the three of us were simply people enjoying a quiet evening by the lake, far removed from the expectations of the outside world. The sky had darkened now, the stars beginning to peek out one by one. Stephen opened the trunk of the car and pulled out a blanket, laying it on the ground near the water's edge. Why don't we sit here for a while, he suggested. We've got nowhere to be, and the night's just starting. Nick nodded, and without hesitation, I found myself agreeing as well. We settled onto the blanket, the three of us sitting side by side, watching the stars reflect off the lake's surface. It was peaceful, almost surreal, and yet something in the air felt charged, as if the night was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. Let me know if you're ready for part 3, where the atmosphere shifts even more, and the story delves into deeper emotions. As we sat there, side by side under the vast night sky, a sense of intimacy began to build, slowly but unmistakably. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't need words, just the shared experience of something rare, being truly present in the moment. Stephen, always the talkative one, broke the silence first, but his tone was different now, softer, more introspective. You know, Auntie, I've been thinking about something lately, he began, his eyes still fixed on the stars. Life is short. You get to a point where you realize you haven't done half the things you wanted to, and then it hits you. There's no time to wait. I glanced over at him, surprised by his sudden vulnerability. Stephen had always been the fun-loving, carefree nephew who lived in the moment. Hearing him talk like this reminded me that he wasn't the young boy I had watched grow up anymore. He was a man with his own thoughts, regrets, and desires. You're still young, Stephen, I replied gently. You've got plenty of time to figure things out. Trust me, when you're my age, you realize that all those things you worried about, they didn't matter as much as you thought. Nick, sitting quietly beside him, finally spoke, his voice carrying a deeper resonance. That's easy to say when you've lived as long as you have. But when you're in the thick of it, when you're feeling that pressure, it's different. It feels like everything is happening too fast. There was something about the way Nick spoke that struck a chord in me. He was right. It was easy for me at my age to say that life slows down. But for them, in the prime of their lives, everything must have felt urgent, overwhelming even. They were searching for something, and they had brought me along for the ride, perhaps thinking I could offer wisdom. But what could I really say that would make sense to them in their moment of uncertainty? I let the silence linger for a moment, thinking carefully about my next words. I understand where you're coming from. It's hard to see the big picture when you're in the middle of it. But you two, you're smart, thoughtful, and kind. Whatever path you choose, you'll find your way. Stephen turned toward me, his expression softer now, grateful. I know, Auntie. I guess I want to feel like I'm not missing out on anything. You know, like I've experienced everything I need to before it's too late. Nick nodded, his gaze intense as he added, We all want that. But sometimes it's not about chasing everything. Sometimes it's about appreciating what's in front of you. His words hung in the air, and I found myself wondering if there was more to what he was saying. The way Nick looked at me, steady, deep, with a hint of something unspoken, made me feel like I was part of what he was talking about. It was a strange feeling, one I hadn't experienced in decades. There was no denying the connection we all shared in that moment, but it was uncharted territory, unfamiliar for someone like me, who had long left behind the days of flirtation and intrigue. Stephen, sensing the subtle shift in energy, moved closer to me, just enough that I could feel his warmth. Auntie, you've lived such a full life. What's one thing you wish you'd done differently? I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. The truth was, there were many things I wished I'd done differently, risks I hadn't taken, moments I let slip by. But did I regret them? Not exactly. Life had unfolded the way it had, and for the most part, I was content. I think, I started, choosing my words carefully. I wish I had allowed myself more freedom, to be spontaneous, to embrace the unknown, to not be so concerned with what was expected of me. But you know, it's never too late to live like that, even at my age. Stephen's eyes flickered with something, excitement perhaps. He smiled, and before I knew it, he reached over and took my hand in his. It was a small gesture, one that could be easily misinterpreted, but in that moment, it felt like more. His hand was warm, strong, grounding me in the moment. You're right, he said softly. It's never too late. Nick, who had been quietly watching the exchange, shifted closer too, though he didn't speak. His presence, however, was enough to make my heart beat just a little faster. I hadn't felt this way in years, this sense of being seen. Not as an old woman, but as a person with desires, with depth. The three of us sat there, the boundaries between us blurred by the night, by the intimacy of the moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive in a way I hadn't anticipated. And though nothing inappropriate had happened, the air between us was charged with the possibility of something unspoken, something deeper than just a friendly visit. It was a connection that transcended age, time, and expectation. It was about being human, about wanting to feel alive, no matter how old or young you were. The night seemed to grow quieter as the weight of the unspoken hung between us. There was something different now, something undeniable. The air was thick with a tension that wasn't uncomfortable, but palpable, an awareness that we had reached a crossroads, a moment where intentions were questioned and lines could easily be blurred. Stephen, still holding my hand, looked at me with an intensity that made me feel both vulnerable and curious. I was 76 years old, but in that moment, age felt like nothing more than a number. For the first time in decades, I was reminded of what it was like to be wanted, not for my wisdom, not out of obligation, but for something far more intrinsic. There was something deeper stirring in both him and Nick, and I couldn't help but feel drawn into it. Stephen, I began softly, pulling my hand away ever so gently. I know what you're feeling right now. I can see it in your eyes. But I need you to understand something. He watched me closely, nodding, as if waiting for me to unlock some great truth that would help him make sense of the moment. I'm not the same person I was years ago, I said, feeling the words settle in my chest. And neither are you. You're at a point in your life where everything feels possible, where the world is wide open to you. But this feeling you have right now, it's not about me, not really. Nick, who had remained quietly observing, finally spoke. Maybe it's not just about you, but it's definitely about this moment. We're all here, experiencing something we didn't expect, and you're part of that, whether you want to admit it or not. His words were deliberate, almost soothing, and I could sense that he was trying to keep the conversation from slipping into something it shouldn't be. He was right, of course. This moment wasn't just about me. It was about the connection between all three of us, the shared understanding, that sometimes life brings you to the edge of something unexpected, but it's up to you whether to cross that line or not. Stephen sighed, running his hand through his hair as he looked out over the lake. You're right, Auntie. I don't want to cross a line I can't uncross. But this, I don't know, it feels like something I can't just ignore. There was a vulnerability in his voice, and I realized that this wasn't just about physical attraction or some fleeting infatuation. It was about the deeper yearning he had been feeling, the desire to connect, to experience something real in a world that often felt shallow and temporary. And somehow, in this strange twist of fate, I had become part of that search for meaning. Nick leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine, and I could see the same depth in them that I had sensed earlier. We don't have to do anything we'll regret, but it's okay to admit that this moment matters. It's okay to let it mean something. His words struck a chord in me. It had been so long since I had allowed myself to feel anything like this. And now, here I was, on the verge of something that could either be a fleeting connection or a profound experience. The line was thin, but it was still there. I looked between the two of them, these young men who were so full of life and uncertainty, and I realized that what we were sharing wasn't inappropriate. It was human. It was about being seen, being valued, and being present with one another. You're both good men, I finally said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. And you're right, this moment does matter, but what matters more is what we take away from it. Stephen looked down, a faint smile playing on his lips. You're wise, Auntie. I guess that's why we needed you here tonight. Nick nodded, his gaze softening as the tension in the air began to dissipate. Yeah, I think we all needed this. A reminder that life isn't always about chasing after the next thrill. Sometimes, it's about slowing down and appreciating what's in front of you. For the first time that evening, I felt the tension lift, replaced by a sense of calm, of mutual understanding. We had shared something real, something that didn't need to be physical or scandalous to matter. We had reached the edge, and instead of crossing it, we chose to reflect on what it meant to simply be present with one another, to appreciate the bond we had formed without pushing it into dangerous territory. Stephen let out a breath, standing up and stretching. Well, I think it's time to head back before we get too deep in our thoughts. Auntie, you ready? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I'm ready, Stephen. Nick stood as well, offering me a hand to help me up. You've still got it, you know that? You're more alive than most people half your age. I chuckled, taking his hand as I stood. I think you two just reminded me of that. As we walked back to the car, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the night, for their company, for the opportunity to feel truly alive again. The drive home was quiet but comfortable, filled with the kind of silence that only comes after a moment of understanding has passed between people. We didn't need to say much more. We had shared something that went beyond words. As we pulled up to my house, Stephen helped me out of the car, giving me a warm hug. Thanks for coming with us, Auntie. Tonight, it meant a lot. It meant a lot to me too, Stephen, I replied, squeezing his hand before turning to Nick, who gave me a nod and a smile. Take care, ma'am, and don't be a stranger, Nick added. I waved them off as they drove away, the quiet hum of the car fading into the night. As I stood on my porch, looking up at the stars, I couldn't help but smile. Life, it seemed, still had a few surprises left for me after all.